I think I first got involved in the NFL when it very first started on Channel 4. Actually, can't really remember liking it that much for the first couple of years. But I was kind of determined to try because there just wasn't enough sport going on, really, 23 and a half hours a day. In terms of the edge, I think we were talking about this earlier. I think it could be summarised in a way, I'll try and say it in a clear way. I think the initial line that first gets set is an attempt to split the money. So the line maker puts the price up at which they think they'll take roughly even action both sides. They put up a market that they think will divide the money. They don't try and put up a market that can't be beaten. So they don't try and attempt to predict the result of the game accurately. So I think that gives you an edge in the market. For example, a Vegas casino, and obviously I appreciate that the Vegas casinos are not as important in the NFL market as they used to be, but in the days when Vegas casinos were kind of important, if you would think that Oakland should be a 3-point favorite in this game on everything they've done, and if you set it at 3, that would, in the long run, mean that the market was unbeatable. They would sometimes make Oakland 3.5 because half of LA come to Vegas every Saturday and Sunday, and that's where they're going to take money. And I think that might sound like quite a small thing to beat, but I think that is essentially where the edge is in NFL.
Mike, legendary broadcaster. And
This is just like doing a podcast with Neil. He talks and talks and talks, and then finally passes the mic along. It's also like doing television, because I'm looking at a picture of myself right here. When you're doing television and the monitors are there, you always have to stop from looking at yourself talking to see if you actually look as stupid as you sound in your own ear. But I came to football from playing it. My dad had played high school and college football until he decided that having fought in a war, he was wasting his time playing college football. But we were big fans, went to lots of college games when I was young. There was never any doubt I was going to play, and I played, again, high school and college. I was much too small, slow, and not tough enough, sort of, to move on to the next level. But I went into television and news agency work, and it turned out that I was the only person in this news agency in London who could write a story about cricket. And the editor said to me, "How do you understand cricket?" And I said, "It's a game. Games are easy to understand." And little did I know that from that point I'd be doing mostly sports, and then eventually I moved on from the behind the camera to in front of the camera side, and then writing about doing football on BBC, on Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky, and eventually moved into writing for some of the sites. My expertise in gambling is virtually nil, but since I started doing some poker commentary for a brief period, when the original boom of poker came up, when I first started hearing Jesse and all, I got more and more interested in the gambling side, and it's a fascinating thing to learn, and I know Neil from those days. But basically, when we do the podcasts for Matchroom, when I write about gambling sites, I'm mostly there to try to look at it from the football angle. So I'm one of the marks that the bookies depend on.
But you're an X's and O's man. I mean,
predominantly, yeah. I mean, football's an interesting game. American football's an interesting game because it's so heavily strategized and game planned. It's like a game of chess, except that you're dealing with live 300-pound human beings playing the chess, so that you can be a great coach and you can scheme everything perfectly, but if one guy defeats your guy, everything goes bust, which is, as a commentator, is the fascinating part of the game, but as a gambler, it could be the very frustrating part. And I think one of the things that these guys are talking about, and we've been talking about it today, and I'm fascinated by it, are the ways you simply beat that. You get away from that kind of micro-analysis of the game and into the macro business of making money on it.
My first exposure to American, I was one of those 80s children who remember Mick Lockhurst and Gary Imlach, if anyone can remember those guys. Mick Longhurst, was it? Mick Lockhurst. Channel 4, 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening when there were only 4 channels in the UK. There was American football on and I enjoyed it. Went to university and actually played for the world famous Bristol Bullets. Probably wouldn't have been quite at the standard you played at. It was terrible, but really enjoyed it. And then when I got involved in betting and the betting industry, about 6 or 7 years ago, built a rating system which I used for betting on football. Or when I say I built it, my attitude to building models is the same as my dad's to DIY. I get someone else to do it. And trying to adjust that football model to work for the NFL was something that I've been doing over the next couple of years. And when you break it down, there are a lot of similarities. For an Asian handicap football betting model, you need 2 outputs, the supremacy and the total goals. And for the NFL, you need 2 outputs, the supremacy and the total points. So there's a lot of similarities between the two in terms of finding your price. Then there are also a lot of differences as well, in which intricacies of American football, which other sports may not have, like key numbers, which I'm sure we'll probably come on to soon.
Hello. I got into NFL through Madden, the PlayStation game. I had a friend at school who kept banging on about Michael Vick and how good he was, so started playing that and watched my first Super Bowl that year and just gradually got into it that way. So I think there's a couple of reasons people can have an edge in NFL. I think someone said after the Broncos-Giants game last week, Broncos were 13-point favourites, and obviously they lost by 10 points odd. And someone said the athletes on the field, they're all the sort of 0.01% of athletes in America. And the difference between them, even the Giants reserves against the Broncos, there just isn't that much difference. But people, they've watched the games last week, they've got this idea that the Giants, they're awful, they can't be beaten, which obviously is not true. So people underestimate the randomness, kind of overreact week to week, and if you can cancel out some of that noise, I think there can be an edge to be found.
So, I mean, you sort of got right into my next question, which is there's a lot of stats, and the data sets are actually quite small because of the sample size. So maybe we could just talk about really quickly your favorite stat to use, and maybe the most overrated stat, you know.
My favourite stat, I think it's probably a lot of people's favourite stat, is yards per play and net yards per play differential. Obviously, again, there's a lot of randomness, but if a team is successful, on a down-to-down basis, they're doing well, that's a good indicator. And more recently, I've been looking closer at net yards per pass attempt. I think there's sort of studies have shown that the passing game is about 3 times more important to winning a game than the rushing game. So if you're a good pass attack, you're going to be more successful that way. And then another newish one I've been looking at more recently is success rate. Again, it's kind of staying ahead of the down and distance. If you're in 2nd and 3, you're going to be a lot more successful. And I think that's something that's good coaches seem to be able to do this. I think the Rams lead the NFL in the league this year, and then obviously the Falcons were very good at it last year, so that's a good one to look at.
Similar to that, I think 1st and 2nd down success rate is really important. I think sites like Football Outsiders have done a lot of work on how 3rd down success over time regresses towards the mean. So getting yourself in short third down situations is huge. What you do on 1st and 2nd down, very important. Second thing I like to look at is things that affect results but have a high amount of randomness. And a good example, Chicago this season in terms of fumble recoveries. I think it's generally accepted that causing fumbles is a skill, recovering them is random. Because if you look at any team's fumble recovery rate 2 years in a row, there's no correlation whatsoever. So teams like Chicago are pretty much a bad team, have managed to disguise their results by the randomness of recovering more fumbles than really they should. And that can get into the market because they're a team with a record on the back of it, which makes them look a better team than they really are.
Which is a really good point, because you're always dealing in NFL terms with a very small sample size, 16-game season. Any other sport that you're looking at, you've got a much bigger sample. So even something like fumble recoveries, which is indeed random, over a 16-game season, you may still not get a change in that as it goes along. I've seen the stats that we're talking about. There's another one, which is simply to take the team's overall passer rating, which the NFL does, and it's not particularly revealing in itself, but then take their defensive rating or the rating of the teams that they play, passer rating, and subtract the one from the other. And the bigger that margin is, that tends to have a fairly high correlation with teams that are successul or not. I haven't figured out a stat from Madden that you could do yet, but in a game this weekend, a rookie receiver, Juju Smith-Schuster from the Steelers, had a 97-yard touchdown run in which 3 guys could not catch him, and he's not known for speed. And when they asked him how he outran the guys after the game, the first thing he said was, well, my Madden speed rating is 82 or 83. I want to get it up over 90.
I guess I don't disagree with anything anybody said. I was going to say what Nick said about turnovers, which I think is quite a good one. Fumbles. I think Buffalo have had 8 fumble recoveries more than they fumbled this year, which must be luck, really, and should regress to the mean, you would think. I actually think Buffalo are probably about the worst team that are doing well this year, and I think actually. Simon's here, isn't he? I can't see him, but he's a big Buffalo fan. There you are. I guess they're a team I'm going to end up betting against a few times between now and Christmas. I like to look at a lot of situational things. I'm a big fan of looking at who is this team going to play next week, and who have they just played. Teams the week before they go to London is a really good thing to oppose. Teams the week before they play a divisional rival on a Thursday night or a Sunday night or a Monday night football is a good thing to oppose. Things like that are kind of quirks in the schedule more than the X's and O's of how the game's going to be played. I spend quite a lot of time looking at that kind of thing.
Does anybody have any questions they want to jump in with? Please.
Are you guys interested in how far the teams have had to travel before they play? I mean, I know this matters a lot in the UK in football. Is it something that bears out soccer in American sport?
Should we all 4 of us answer it, or somebody pick it?
Is it travel?
Travel.
Yeah. Well, the biggest one, traditionally, and that everybody looks at, and we were talking about this before because, obviously the odds makers are aware of people's perception of it. But when you travel from the West Coast to the East Coast, and then you play a 1 o'clock game, your body clock is still in the morning if you're on West Coast time. And teams have tended to get off to slow starts, in particular, first half, which in results terms may not affect the result one way or the other, but when you're betting, say, first half result, that's a good one to consider. The London thing used to be, or we used to figure that, and I'm not sure exactly how accurate it was, but the team coming over on the short rest, playing at 6 o'clock London time, would be okay because the body clocks would be at 1 o'clock East Coast time in the States. So if they were flying from the East Coast, they'd be good. But we saw this year when they were playing early at 1 o'clock, that same factor applied always to the team that had come short, especially if you watched any of the games. Miami and Baltimore both came out and looked like their legs were in cement and were completely flat, and both got killed in the London games.
And I think something else to bear in mind is when teams have to do it back-to-back. So there's a case this week with Oakland Raiders who played in Buffalo on the other side of the country last Sunday. This Sunday they go to Miami. Actually, they've decided to stay on the East Coast rather than fly back and back again. So you need to make a judgment call there really about, on the back of a thumping loss in Buffalo, is staying on the East Coast something that's advantageous to them or not? Probably.
And it's not just about whether it affects things, but whether the market overrates it. Isn't that almost more important?
Well, I think on the teams flying east, I think it's a big factor, obviously, and I definitely agree with you, Mike, on the first half stuff. I think you could make money betting first half unders in those games. But if you just, I read an article not that long ago where somebody had done the work on teams flying east to play in the morning, and it's overcompensated in the market. Even though they're at a disadvantage, the market's taken care of it already, and if you actually bet them, you'll make a profit.
But I mean, Mike alluded to the London games, and I mean, you know, are the London games still a big mystery? I think we talked about it on the podcast, and there seemed to be a sense that a lot of the real sharp syndicates are kind of avoiding the London games even up to now.
Because it's something you really don't know, and nobody really has a formula for it. And coaches hate it, regardless of what they say, because it takes them off their normal routine. And this is the big thing about travel. It's the big thing about short weeks. A team traveling on Thursday has so much less time to prepare. You know, both teams have the same sort of lack of time for their bodies to recover, and they should not be playing on Thursdays, is the pure and simple truth. But if you're traveling and you lose that extra time, you have less time to prepare, you have less time to practice, and you go into the game kind of raw. And when you think that, you know, we used to figure, I think, that there was a built-in 3-point home field advantage, and I think that's very much overrated now. And you know, if you look at a 3-point spread and say, well, they're at home, so the bookies are saying it's actually an even game, I think they're actually taking advantage of you in that sense, because the home field advantage just doesn't seem to be as strong as it was, say, a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of reasons for that why it might not be, but on a football side. But I think keeping an eye on that is important.
I think one point to make on the London thing, which is interesting, is Jacksonville have played one game here every year for the last 5 years. They've got to come over 5 times and decide how best to schedule that. And they've decided now they fly over on a Friday. They don't come over and have the whole week here. They come in, treat it as a business trip, play the game and come home. Don't even adjust their body clocks too much.
How are they doing against the spread?
The last 3 years, very well. The first 2, no good. But since they've done it this way, and then last Sunday, the game here at Arizona, not the one just gone, the one before, Arizona against the Rams, was it? Arizona came over the whole week, turned up on a Monday, got beat 40-0 against the Rams, who flew in on a Friday and did it Jacksonville's way. That may be something to keep an eye on next season.
And just on the London game as well, I saw a stat earlier this week. Favourites of 4 points or more in neutral site games, they're 10-0 against the spread, so the last 10 games. I was just trying to, with trends, I'm not a huge fan of them, but if
London favourites are 14-7 now.
Yeah, if you try and think about why it might make sense, you know, say the Browns, you know, they've come over to London, and then, you know, they find themselves down and, you know, give up the game. Essentially, they're not playing for anyone there. They just want to go home. So it could make sense. And I think the next example of that, I think the Patriots are playing in Mexico City, week 11, something like that. So maybe one to look at there.
Yeah, please, over here.
Right, to do all these analysis about how many running yards and rushing yards, obviously the guys in Las Vegas or whatever, or wherever around in America where they price the prices up, they don't generally get it wrong. So they're doing that, and the research that I could do doesn't really, I'm not going to be able to do better than the research they've done. The question I've got is, in a situation, say like with Aaron Rodgers at the moment, where he's broke his collarbone and he's out the game, they're obviously going to factor an element into that for the price. Now, with their repricing, because he's out the game, are they going to overcompensate for him being injured, or is there going to be there's still going to be a weight of traffic from Green Bay Packer fans who are going to? Where's your edge there? Is it? Are they going to overcompensate for Aaron Rodgers or undercompensate for him?
Well, historically, they've undercompensated for him. I think when he was last injured, the Packers, I think, went 0-4 against the spread, something like that. And obviously, against the Saints, they didn't cover. The number started at +6. The Packers were underdogs. And then, obviously, the market thought, that's too much. I think it was 12 points or something. They said Rodgers is not worth 12 points. Back Green Bay into 3.5, and then it wasn't enough again. So I mean, I'm not sure anyone knows exactly, but 10 points is kind of the accepted wisdom at roughly, I guess?
I thought 12.5 was too much. I backed Green Bay and I lost. So that was, and I may be back in Green Bay again this week, so I haven't learned my lesson.
Yeah, it's tempting, isn't it? But the main the reason they undercompensate is that it's hard to actually accept that Green Bay's success is so much down to Aaron Rodgers, that it's his individual skill that makes the rest of the team that much better, at least on offense. And since their defense has been, for an incredible number of years now, constantly dogged by injury and always trying to fill in spots, you really do depend on one guy. And there aren't too many other teams that I can remember in the past few years where you would be that dependent. Maybe Peyton Manning in his Indianapolis days.
But it's kind of what you were saying, which is that there's no way that I'm going to be able to do as much research and look at the data in the same way that the professionals do. And yet, Neil, what makes the NFL special? You seem to believe that there still is an angle in for the normal guy.
He hit on part of it, is that the way the lines are set is to get you coming on both sides. So, you can't set a line that might be, say, accurate in terms of the result because you're not going to get the betting down on it. So the line tends to come to where it will attract bettors on both sides.
I mean, I kind of believe that, and I'm sure there's some people in the audience thinking, well, that's rubbish. They don't really do that. I'm sure there's people in bookmaking here that are saying, what you really do is that you set a line to charge your kind of recreational customers as much as possible, but to avoid giving money away to your shrewder customers. And if your shrewder customers do come in, you attempt to move the line to get with them. And I'm sure that is the game that's being played in trading rooms around the world. But to answer Muzz's question a little bit, I not specifically talk about Aaron Rodgers, although I do remember when Andrew Luck was injured a couple of years ago, it was a similar situation because it was such a kind of one-man team, and there were much more than Green Bay are actually, that they were really going to be screwed without Luck, and the market moved a hell of a lot, but it wasn't enough. So there are certain players, but I, as a more general point, I would say that the market in NFL overrates injuries, particularly running backs we were talking about just before we came on. The game has become a passing game in recent years, and sometimes you see, this game's off the board at the moment because such and such a running back is doubtful. And, you could pick 3 guys off the street that probably wouldn't, get them to play, and it wouldn't make 1 point's worth of difference. So I think generally speaking, I would bet against when the market overreacts to an injury, but with a quarterback in certain teams like a star player like Rodgers, or a team that's really dependent on their quarterback like Indianapolis with Luck, maybe that's an exception to the rule.
Yeah, and just quickly on the point that you can't do as much research as these bookmakers setting like the player props and those kind of lines. There's enough research out there from the DFS industry, just for example. So Evan Silver, who I'm sure everyone has heard of, he writes a column on rotoworld.com, and he goes through every single fantasy-worthy player in every single game. And if you just read that column alone, you'd have a good idea of the matchups, and you'd probably do pretty well on the player props. I used to do that a lot. If anyone's not been banned from Sky Bet, have a go at them. And so I would read that. It'll take you 40 minutes odd because it's very in-depth. But then you do have a good insight who's injured, who's got a good matchup, if there's wide receiver edge, an offensive line edge. So there's information out there that can give you a good knowledge pretty quickly.
Want some more light entertainment?
Yeah.
There was a story when Peyton Manning was playing in Indianapolis. Tom Moore was the offensive coordinator, and he was talking to some journalist, and the guy said, I go to practice every week, and I never see your backup quarterback practicing with the first team. You never play him at the end of games. What do you do if Peyton Manning gets hurt? And he said, and Manning wore 18. He said, if 18 gets hurt, we're fucked, and we don't practice fucked.
Good. You don't need that. I wanted to, it's interesting, the running backs are overrated, the quarterbacks are underrated. What about coaching in the NFL? How important is it? How do you guys rate it, and how does it change?
Yeah, I think it's really important. When we were talking about like London favourites, I think a lot of that comes down to coaching, and you know, there's a big kind of, more generally, there's a big thing in NFL betting about whether trends are a good thing to look at or not. But I think quite a lot of those trends that depend on favourites, it's often like the best team, and the best team is often the best coach team. In a world where it's a sport with a salary cap, and you can only spend a certain amount of a certain amount of money on skilled player positions because of the salary cap. It's amazing to me that there isn't a salary cap on the coaches, and the coaches probably make more difference than most of the individual players. So why wouldn't, in a multi-billion pound sport, why wouldn't you just triple the salary of the best coaches and make sure you hold on to them? Maybe, and an example might be Mike Shanahan has left Atlanta as the offensive coordinator. Kyle Shanahan, sorry. And been replaced by Steve Sarkisian, I think you'd say. And yeah, I mean, it's a massive drop-off for Atlanta this year. And, you know, he cashed in his chips at a peak, having just been to the Super Bowl and wanted to advance his career. I understand that. But, you know, given there's no salary cap, just give him as much money as he possibly wants.
Yeah, there are coaches, when we talk about, say, the London games, there are coaches who, you know, there's a few who will just get on the plane and then we're going to play the game when we get to the other end. There's other coaches who will investigate and research and make sure their team is going to go at sort of the way that they think they'll get the best performance out of them. And there are I mean, it's generally sort of thought that Bill Belichick is the best coach in the NFL, and he's certainly probably the only one who will produce completely different game plans week in and week out. You know, there's kind of two ways of coaching, and one is that you do the same thing all the time and you just execute really well, which is kind of the Vince Lombardi kind of theory of coaching. And then there's the Belichick one, is you adjust to the other team's weakness and you try to attack their weakness, get the matchups you want. And I've always thought that the way to beat his team, the best way to beat his team, is to be physically punishing and just beat them up. So they always have trouble with teams that can do that, or teams that can confuse their offense, which is what they try to do to other teams. So you get this, like this year is a good example, you get this great triangle where New England kills Pittsburgh whenever they play Pittsburgh, who tend to play a very simple offensive style and a very physical defense, but not, say, as dominant up front as Baltimore's, which always used to give New England trouble. Kansas City kills New England because Andy Reid manages to out-scheme and confuse Belichick, and Pittsburgh kills Kansas City because the Chiefs basically can't stop a three-man offense that have, and I love that triangle. And it's different styles of coaching, but I think you really have to look at the style, the coaching and style of play matchup whenever you get those teams going against each other.
I value coaching second only to quarterback for the most important factor when looking at a game.
And as far as it being underrated by the market as well, or.
Yeah, you have to pick your spots like anything else, but yeah, I do think coaching can be underrated. There was an example, and I'll tell the story quickly, of Cleveland against Tennessee the week before last. The game ended up going to overtime. Cleveland lost 12-9. And Cleveland for years just can't get out of their own way on the pitch and coaching. The difference between English football and American football, I think, in terms of coaching, is the number of in-game decisions that a coach has to make in the NFL. Yes, a football coach can make substitutions, can try to change things tactically, but the sheer number of in-game decisions that an NFL coach has to make, it makes the game a little bit unique. Cleveland at 0-0 in the first quarter against Tennessee. Tennessee were driving, had a third and one situation at Cleveland's 25, just inside field goal range. Tennessee committed a personal foul. It was a 15-yard penalty. It would have moved them out of field goal range. Cleveland chose to not accept that penalty, make it a 4th and 1, still in field goal range. Tennessee line up to go for it on 4th down, as they're entitled to. Cleveland jump offside and it's a first down. Within 2 minutes, Cleveland have gone for a situation where they're about to get the ball back at 0-0 to 3-0 down through no skill of Tennessee's, just coaching. And those differences can and do affect games.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's hugely important. I mean, you only have to look at the Rams. Last year with Jeff Fisher, Jared Goff was the worst quarterback in the league, worst rookie season ever. This year he's, Pro Bowl level almost, and they're 5-2. But to be honest, I've not yet managed to work it into my handicapping properly. I'm not sure how you would. I mean, the Rams this week, they've probably got a significant coaching advantage against the Giants, because Ben McAdoo's considered a bit of a pleb. But is it? I don't know. Is it factored in the number?
That's a good point, because he and McVay are basically the same guy.
Yeah.
Both teams hired them for the same young coach for the same reason, offensive, masterminding.
But yeah, I think it might be factored into the number given their performance thus far this season. So it doesn't necessarily play into my handicapping, I guess.
Is it fair to say, I mean, between soccer and NFL, or football and NFL, that with soccer, almost everybody bets late because there is not much liquidity early, and with NFL, you do have more of a choice. And if so, what do you guys think about the way markets move and how you time your bets? I mean, is that...
I think I actually heard something really interesting this week. I was talking to a fella, a horse racing guy who some of you will know, James Willoughby, who's a complete nutcase on horse racing. And he comes up with all kinds of wild theories. But he said something really I thought was quite astute, which is that between Monday and Saturday, the NFL market's just getting knocked into shape by professionals. I mean, you remember, Jesse, because you love old Vegas, the Stardust line. So on the Sunday night after the games are finished, they used to have a lottery in the Stardust Casino, and you'd win a place in the queue to have the first shot at the new prices on next week's games. And if you were number one in the queue, they would say, right, if you enter the lottery, you have to have a bet, and you have to have a bet of 1,000. You couldn't have bigger, you couldn't have less. And you're allowed one bet, and then you can go to the back of the queue if you like, if you want to do more bets. And all the professionals would line up and do that, and that's how the market was established. And of course, these days, it's slightly different. But the prices go up vaguely in the Caribbean on Sunday night, and a couple of Vegas sports books, and then Pinnacle kind of get involved, and that basically leads the market. But you still are going to struggle to get a $5,000 bet on with any bookmaker on a Sunday night, on next week's games. And it's Thursday when, the limits kind of double and everything gets a bit more interesting. And that traditionally, over the last kind of 5 or 10 years, has been when all the action takes place, sort of English time, kind of 5 p.m. Through 10 p.m. on a Thursday. A lot of the syndicates start taking positions. It's completely different now. It seems to happen all kinds of funny times. There's been 2 or 3. There was a big move this Monday, on Monday gone, on this Thursday game. Like the money came in from syndicates for the Jets, and yesterday there was a big move from 2 or 3 sources that continued over a period of time on the over in the Houston-Indianapolis game, and. That would never have happened a few years ago. So the market's evolving all the time. But what James said was that by the time you get to people in America going to bed on Saturday, the market's as efficient as it can possibly be, because it's all professionals playing against other professionals in the week. And then on Sunday, the shop door opens and all the recreationals come bounding in and knock them all out of shape again. And games that were trading at 6.5 all week and haven't moved suddenly go off 3.5 and open up a whole bunch more value. So Sunday afternoons are still pretty exciting. And people used to say, well, you can't really beat the off prices. The price on the off with Pinnacle is 100% correct. And I just don't buy that at all.
So you could beat the markets on Monday and Sunday, but never Saturday night.
Saturday night is for dancing, Jesse.
When do you bet, Nick?
When you've got a 4-month-old baby, you bet whenever you can. I think one thing I'd like to just urge caution with, I see a lot of mentions on Twitter about look-ahead lines. And people obsessed with... Some Vegas casinos price the game for the following week. And people will say, well, this line's moved too far. There's been an overreaction to this result. But those look-ahead lines, there's no sharp money on them. You can't have a decent bet on them if you want to. So they're probably just wrong. So if you're obsessing over a line that was there that no one's bet on and no one could bet on as being an overreaction to the following week, when you actually can bet, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, and to kind of follow up what Neil was saying, the lines, I think there's quite a lot of follower money, I would say. So if, if last week Pittsburgh over 6 all week, pretty much, -6 against the Bengals, and then Sunday I think money started flooding, actually 5.5 all week, money started flooding in, and then they came all the way down to 3.5, which kind of suggested they were 1 point better than the Bengals on a neutral field, which not many people at all, I think, would agree to be true based on the stats at that point. And I think it had just gone too far. Sort of, obviously, some people have seen the move, gone, oh well, the sharps are on the Bengals here. I'll jump in, and I think it goes too far. And there's probably value betting against the moves, at 5.55 on a Sunday.
Yep, sorry, over here.
Hiya. Question for Nick, and Neil, but I think Neil's already made his views clear. Nick, you bet on English football as well as American football. Which do you find easier to beat? Is one a lot more inefficient than the other, and it's easier to make your living from?
I think the biggest difference with the NFL is the shortness of the season and the lack of games. So maximum of 16 games per week for 17 weeks. Whereas in football, you've got unlimited amount of leagues to bet on should you choose to. Now, the efficiency between the English Premier League and the NFL may be quite similar, but if you want to, you can bet Scottish Championship 1 and 2 if you can get on there, and then nothing like a Vegas market. So the difference is in choice and doing what you want to do in football. I find that on average I stake bigger on the NFL, and therefore there's more variance because I'll have fewer bets. I might be sitting on a Sunday and look back and I've had 40 football bets but 5 NFL bets. For the amount of time that I'm putting in, I feel like I have to stake those bigger to justify the time. Whereas in football, I'm betting for 40 weeks, 40 bets a week. That's enough time for, over the course of the season, variance to even itself out. Whereas in the NFL, I know full well it's not. I may do the right things and have a losing season this year, and vice versa. I may be rubbish and win.
And is there one sport that you flat stake in and one sport that you spread stake in, or is that?
No.
Is that just part of the way?
I vary the staking across all sports. And the third sport that I do bet on is snooker, and that's completely different to the other two. It's not a very efficient market. You can win more as a percentage margin, but you can't get the same stakes on or anywhere close to it.
And it's rigged, no.
If you really want the massive action of football, of English football, you look at the college football, where there are, 40, 60 more games, depending on how low they'll go on the cover, or Canadian football, where the betting is just as chaotic as the game is. So, I've not been able to figure out a really good way to kind of bet the CFL at all.
All right, we can take a couple more questions. Sorry, back there, yeah?
Hi, someone mentioned earlier about the first 2 plays, and I agree with that. I grew up on Canadian football, so I can tell you that we had to get it done in 2 plays, otherwise so focus on the first 2 plays and see how the teams do. One thing, we're dealing with 16, 17 matches a year, or 17 weeks, 16 matches. Do you find that the big plays skew all the data? Because all it takes is 2 big passes, 2 big runs, and suddenly when people start looking at the numbers, you're seeing decent offenses, and at the end of the day, it actually came down that 25% of the yards came down to a handful of plays.
It does to an extent, but you sort of factor in the big play potential, at least of offenses or defenses that give them up. It's the special teams play, the turnovers, that are harder, almost impossible to predict. And one of the smaller reasons, but I think it's a factor in what seems to be increasing parity of not so good teams in the NFL. In other words, this year there's some really bad teams and there are no really good teams, and you've got a parity in the middle. Taking the kickoff out of the game takes away maybe, I don't know, 5% of the big plays you might have over a season. And it's one of the ways for a lesser team to actually to get up on a better team. You know, when you see big upsets, you generally find that the lesser team has had a turnover for a touchdown at some point in there.
I think from a player perspective as well, the player you'd rather have on your team is the consistent. So, 2 running backs, 10 attempts for 40 yards. You want the guy that's making 4 yards every time, not the 1 yard, 1 yard, 1 yard, 31 yards to finish with. The boom and bust guy there is not as valuable, and that's actually a good part of the reason I think Miami decided to trade Jay Ajayi away yesterday for only a 4th round pick, which looks like they're not getting a great deal. Well, I don't think Jay Ajayi is the sort of running back that many teams love because of that boom and bust thing. And secondly, running backs are a dime a dozen anyway. You can find a replacement on the street these days.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right about these big plays, the explosive plays. They can warp the numbers a bit, which is especially yards per play. But that's why, as I mentioned, the success rate play or play percentage of plays that are a success. That's another important stat. I think Massey Peabody, who again I'm sure most people have heard of, their model, it basically uses yards per play and play success rate for passing and rushing. So 4 different stats, and that's pretty much their model. And they've beaten the market for 5 years odd. So I think it's important to use several stats essentially.
We've got a question over here, I think. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, is there anything specifically in play that we should be looking out for?
Yes.
You're probably one of the only guys here who does do a lot of in-play betting. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. It's something I wanted to talk about because I think it's definitely a good trading sport and some in-play opportunities. So a couple of things that I think can be edges. First of all, injuries. Like again, Washington on Sunday, it was common knowledge all week that the offensive line was going to be down 3 or 4 starters. And then in the game, they lost another starter and they lost 2 tight ends and then they lost their edge rusher, Ryan Kerrigan, for some plays. I must have bet the Cowboys about 8 times live because there's no chance that this isn't going to get them in the second half. And you know they got lucky to cover sort of 14 in the end, but they had that game won easily. And I think another edge is when the pre-game line was wrong. So, for example, again Sunday, the Buccaneers, the Panthers, the line was 46 total points. But there was 20 miles an hour winds. But I think a lot of the modelling guys, they were betting over. But if you looked at the weather, obviously wind has a huge effect. And that's how it played out. So 10 points have been scored at halftime. And watching it, I'm going, well, obviously the pre-game line was wrong. But they still put out the second half line at 22 points or something. And again, so, you know, bet under, it's too high. And 10 points were scored in the second half as well. So, you know, look, if you can work out where the pre-game line was wrong for whatever reason, then you can. The second half lines are often based off that.
A couple of things to add. At half time, looking at the number of plays a defence has been on the field, you can spot defences that are very tired or about to tire in the fourth quarter. If they've been on the field for 25 of the 30 minutes compared to the other team, that often factors in later on. One more thing would be matchup battles that you'd factored into your pricing beforehand. If you thought a certain cornerback would be able to cope with a receiver well, and you thought that a big part of the reason you liked that team was that this matchup battle was in favour of this team, and you watched the first half and that's just not the case, you need to reevaluate.
That's a lot easier to see when you're actually at the game, because we did that on Sunday at Twickenham. I just, while we were watching it in the fourth quarter, they're gassed. I mean, they're not going to be able to play in the fourth quarter. And one of the technicians for BBC was on his phone immediately, punching in a bet somewhere. Commercials. Once when you watch a game on TV and they go to commercial, you don't see what's happening, on the field and who's sitting there with their knees bent and their arms up.
It's easier in the UK. It's more accepted. You can you can do that.
Do you want me to crack on?
Please.
I felt that we were running out of time.
No, I think we have time for one or two more questions, right?
To be honest, I don't do as much in running as I used to because the liquidity isn't really there as much, and I find that you end up thinking that when I do it, I tend to be the market maker, and then I just feel like I'm just getting picked off. But I sort of feel like when I was doing a lot of it, that teams that were a big favourite and now it's not panning out that way, people want to always bet the big favourite to get back in it when they go behind, and I like to tend to be with the underdog who is outperforming. I don't know whether that's still the case in the market. That was certainly 5 years ago when I did quite a lot of NFL in running. That was a bias that I noticed, that if a team had been a 9-point favourite and at half time they're 14-10 down, the market would, certainly in the bit before half time, it was like people had forgotten that we're halfway through the game and time is running out, and they just wanted to keep over betting the favourite, and I tend to like to be on underdogs in that situation, underdogs that are leading. I don't know, do you think that still pans out? Or
I've obviously made a mistake. Want to have a question after Neil spoke?
Sorry, last question over. Yeah, Ian, is that, yeah?
Yeah, just very much with no stats involved. It seems like the standard of kicking this year is very variable. There seems to be a few longer kicks being made, but a lot of kicks being missed. Do you guys place any emphasis on kickers as part of your sort of skill positions and how they may sort of factor into the game?
I definitely don't, but maybe I should, and I've seen a lot of extra point after touchdowns get missed this year, so maybe I should at it. But I haven't, and I haven't thought about it at all.
Yeah, it's funny, especially in games where your total points is low, and each point therefore has more impact. I just tend to look at bad kickers more than good ones, but also, for example, if your game's being played indoors, you're going to probably get better kicking than if it's outdoors. If you're in Denver and the weather's good, you're going to get an extra 5 yards, say, on most kicks. And if it's in winter, then you're going to get less, because when the ball starts to contract, whether or not Tom Brady's let air out of it or put air into it, it's not going to travel as far. But I agree, kicking is a little more random now. Extra points are the weirdest thing, because the percentage of extra points is worse than the percentage of field goals from the same distance. So there's something psychological going on.
I mean, Nick, you were talking before about key points and stuff like that, and certainly the rule changes and stuff like that, that's changed everything about how
multiple
important
rule
key
changes.
points are.
Just going back to the question on kickers, one thing which I think no one really looks at, but teams place a lot of importance on, is the leg strength at kickoffs. If you can kick through the back of the end zone every single time, you're never going to concede a kickoff return touchdown. And special teams coaches place a lot of emphasis on that, and that goes hand. Jacksonville didn't cut their kicker for a very long time because he had such a strong leg at kickoffs, and they let him get away with 3 or 4 field goal misses, which other kickers probably wouldn't have, and fans didn't get why, and I'm convinced that was the reason. They finally said enough was enough with him last week, and he'll never play in the NFL again.
Interestingly, distance of kicks, kickoff distance, is one of the steadier statistics in the NFL. Guys are very consistent on the lengths of their kickoff, whereas field goal accuracy varies, even among the good kickers, varies an awful lot from year to year, for reasons, again, that nobody's really been able to put their finger on.
Okay, can we take one more to wrap it up? All right, nope, sorry, we're out of time. And all right, well, I want to thank everybody, and I know the guys will be around if you want to get some tips for this weekend. But we've got Harry Finley coming up.